Carolina, hello. Florida, hello. And Arkansas, hello. We're glad to have you guys. Also, you've got microphones on your tables. This is meant to be a discussion back and forth. So, Elva, go ahead and can you click out of that? No, just let it go. This is meant to be a discussion. Every one of these ethics classes from now on is going to be built on chapter 1. So if you have not studied intently, thank you very much, studied intently chapter 1, your part of the discussion will be pretty minimal. Yeah, come over to the table if you would. Just let them come to the table. But be sure when you pick up the microphone to speak that you flip it on. If you don't flip it on, Elva's going to call you down and ask you to flip it on. That's for the purpose of recording and also so that the people in North Carolina, Arkansas, and let me get this started, and Florida can hear you. Okay? Does everybody understand?
Yes, sir.
Here?
Yes.
Okay. So we have people sitting in today from other locations. They will not be involved in the conversation just because I hadn't worked out the technology yet. Sooner or later, I hope to be able to throw everything up here to where they can participate in the discussions as well. But what they have got an opportunity to do is to text in any questions or comments that they've got. You can text in to my telephone number, 704-301-5277. Elva will take the text, and then she will relay that question or comment to this whole class. Does everybody understand where we are? So when you pick up a microphone, turn it on. This whole thing is a discussion. So if you haven't studied for chapter 1, which is, for those of you that don't know, it is Ethics for a Brave New World, is our text today, John Feinberg and his son, Paul Feinberg. It's an older text available online for just a few bucks, $5 or $6. You can find it online. But chapter 1 lays out all the premises, all of the parameters, and all of the standards by which we have discussions about any ethical issue. So we're going to review a little bit of that today. But the purpose of today is to take some of those standards and then begin to apply those to specific issues. But you can't speak to those issues with any intelligence whatsoever as far as this class is concerned. In other words, ethical standards, unless you are well versed in chapter 1. And I've been trying to drive that home, but if you haven't got chapter 1, the rest of the book's not going to come together for you. So dig into chapter 1, get the basis of that, and begin to hang on. Okay, so I'm going to start today just by trying to get a few preliminaries up. Let's talk about the difference between secular and Christian ethics. So again, this is a discussion, pick up your microphones, but you tell me, what are the differences that we can start with between secular ethics and Christian ethics? Okay.
First of all, what is secular ethics?
Secular would be anything outside of a Christian worldview, worldly view, a worldly view of ethics.
Oh, okay, that's all.
Okay.
Thanks.
Michael?
I was going to say the difference. Okay, the difference is secular ethics. You could simply say we're based on a worldview ethics, whereas Christian ethics or ethics will be based off of the Bible.
Okay, so we've got to get our terms down. A worldview, there is a such thing as a Christian worldview.
Right. Well, not okay. That's true.
The secular worldview is what you're saying. So when we're trying to be specific, we talk about a secular worldview, meaning the worldly worldview. And so what would that foundation of ethics for a worldly or secular worldview be? What would the foundation for that worldview or ethic be?
Well, when it comes to Christianity, we have our objective. The Bible itself is our objective worldview, but the secular is just a situational. It'll be relational. It'll be whatever fits the time at the, depending on. I know, I forgot the terminology they use, but it depends on the situation itself. I mean,
Okay,
it's more
one
subjective.
type of secular worldview would be situational ethics.
Yeah.
So that's just one type,
Relational.
situational ethics. What would situational ethics be? What does that look like?
Ethics depending on the moment. The ethics of today would be different than the ethics of, say, 50 years ago, whatever the ethics of the day was 100 years ago. It would depend on the situation of the day.
Okay, and even more specific, the situation of the moment. So it can change in a flash. It can change in a fraction of a moment. Yeah,
Right now, we're seeing that in our own world,
yeah.
where the ethics changes almost daily.
Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about how all of this integrates into today, because all of this is relevant to what we're seeing today. It's important that we as Christians understand what we're seeing happen in front of us. And that's one of the reasons that an ethics class is particularly helpful, is that we begin to not only observe and to realize that we're in the middle of this and that something's wrong, but that what is wrong and how do we address that as Christ followers. So it's important that we understand, okay, not only that this is happening, but that here's what is happening and here's why it's happening. So one of the reasons is situational ethics. It comes along and somebody says, well, what should I do about my daughter engaging in premarital sex? What should I do about that? Well, it depends on the situation. Well, it depends on the situation. I mean, do mom and dad know this? Is it open? Is it not open? Where are they having this engagement? I mean, no, it doesn't depend on any of that stuff, right? Doesn't depend. Those are situational things we throw into the pot. One of the reasons that we as a church write down policies is because you don't ever want, as a pastor particularly, you never want to get down the road and let's say Sorrel comes to me and that Sorrel and I have a really good relationship and we understand each other and I like Sorrel, and Sorrel says, can I use the church for this purpose? And I go, well, sure, Sorrel. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely, you can use. And then I have somebody else come to me that I go, I don't really particularly care for this person. And they ask me the same question, could I use it for the same purpose? And I go, no. That's situational ethics. I'm judging that on my relationship here as being a good one versus a relationship where I just don't trust the person, but they're asking me exactly the same question. So we have policies in the church to dictate that to where we're not ever going to engage in situational ethics. We got policy that says, here's how the church can be used, here's when the church can be used, here's under what circumstances the church can be used, and then we apply that to everybody. And it doesn't matter if it's today or next week, it's the same set of principles. Okay, so we don't want to engage in situational ethics. Chris made the comment, okay, for Christian worldview, we're going on, he said, God's Word, the Bible. So the Bible is a standard. What stands behind what the Bible says in terms of it being a standard?
I'm not sure what you mean.
What is, well, I'm going to say this much about it. What stands behind that is God.
God, yeah.
Okay, what stands behind that is God. And what are the standards that God sets? We can look at God's attributes and come up with something about his standards. God's always truthful, he's always honest, he's always these things. He's always love, he's always just, he's always righteous. So those things stand behind our ethic. Those are the things that determine our ethic. What God says is right, not what I think might be right for this situation. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is foundational, And the situational ethics, it's a moving target, isn't it? So what other kind of secular worldview could there be besides situational? Political, absolutely. You got a political worldview. So a political standard, what is acceptable politically? What about this, culturally? Well, is it the standard of our ethic or our morality of what is acceptable culturally? Because that seems to be a moving target too, doesn't it? What Michael was saying earlier is more of a cultural reality, because that becomes a moving target. What works in our culture, we say may not work in another culture.
You know, realistically, aren't all of these, like you said, political and cultural, these are all just different types of situational ethics.
Well,
in reality, because politics change depending on the season, culture changes
Yeah,
depending on
the
the season,
situational
depending
ethic
on the
is-
situation. They're just different types of situational ethics.
Well,
So
the
that-
situational ethics, typically when you talk about situational ethics, we're talking about short-term
Okay,
changes.
well, in that regard, yeah.
And cultural can take many years
True.
to
They're just a
to
larger
evolve.
situation. I get what you're
Yeah. So the cultural,
more
what is
long-term.
culturally acceptable now, we might say this is culturally acceptable, but it may not be acceptable within the Christian community, right? Why? Because we've got a different set of standards. So my point in going through this is this, that when we talk about ethics, we need to understand that when we're talking to somebody that's in the culture, that's speaking politically, or that is dealing with a situational ethic viewpoint, worldview, that their ethic is going to be totally different than ours. So if we understand that from the outset, we understand how we can come up with some of the stuff that's going on in our world all around us. And like I say, it's important for us as Christ followers to go, okay, I understand what's happening. I understand who's involved in that. The enemy's involved in that. And I understand the master of deception can be very tricky. And I understand how these people came up with this position, because what they're telling me is perfectly acceptable is acceptable in our culture. It's acceptable. And so the ethic, the secular ethic, becomes what is, follow me here, what is culturally acceptable in the moment. So we look at all the stuff that's happening around us and we go, well, it's accepted by our culture. So we just accept it and go on. Right? And that's what we're expected to do. We're expected to swallow hard and go on. And then tomorrow we don't have to swallow quite as hard, and the next day not quite as hard after that, because it just becomes more and more acceptable.
Unless it changes every day like it is.
And then we're expected to deal with that. It's like one of the cults that we dealt with in Colorado. The guy's name was Dan Dorlock, and he professed to be the Christ. He lived 7 doors down from us in Colorado. And he would preach one thing one week and preach almost diametrically the opposition to that, or the opposite of that, the following week. And all of his crowd would just go, oh, new revelation. It's a new revelation from God. We're so blessed to have this new revelation. God doesn't change.
No, that was just going to... Yeah, I was going to say, the difference is realistically, you can say is... secular is situational, where you could say Christian ethics is not situational. It is the same logic, the same ethics that existed 2,000 years ago, it's the same now.
Yeah.
Same yesterday, today.
And tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody else? Go ahead, Lynn.
Well, I was wondering if environment had a part of this.
Oh, yeah.
Our
Environment.
the environment meaning the physical environment or the
Yes,
social
yes.
environment?
Physical.
The physical environment. Okay. So in what way? Explain what you mean by that.
Well, in New York City, maybe they're different than Redwood, California.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
Climate
So,
crisis.
What would be something that was an ethical issue that would be dealt with different because of environmental issues, at least from a secular worldview?
Euthanasia.
Why is environment different?
Because say we're in a time of famine, or so like I would say, you could say like in the Sudan now, where you would be dependent on who is going to get fed and who isn't going to get fed, certainly depending on who is going to live and who is going to die, based on the fact of how much food we have to feed people.
Okay, so that would be a situational
That would
ethic.
definitely be a situational
Okay,
ethic.
but is that what you're talking about?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is meant to be a discussion, so explain.
Well, environment, I guess, does fall into culture also,
Yeah,
because different strokes for different folks
right.
in different places.
Okay, so let's use even more extreme than, if there is a more extreme than New York City and Redwood, California, let's try to use a more extreme one than that. Okay, so in some places in South America, the headhunters still engage in eating one another. They'll invade other tribes, and they engage in cannibalism. So they're pretty extreme, isn't it? We would say, never would we do that. But then we don't live too far from Donner Pass, right?
Right on.
So,
Yes.
so here's a real issue. The people, and it's interesting to really dig into this, because the people that engage in cannibalism, and Elva and I had an opportunity to visit with a guy that had been a cannibal. In fact, he was a priest within the culture and a chief within the culture that was cannibalizing his neighbors. Okay, so, and he had become a Christian. So my conversation with him was really interesting. I was going through a translator. But he told me a couple things. Number one, that from the time that they are born into his tribe, they participate in rituals and traditions which dehumanize the other tribe. So they would have to be dehumanized in order to accept cannibalizing them. So that became a brainwashing thing. But he said, even as a little child, I realized they look just like me. They walk just like me. They talk just like me. They're just the next tribe over. But they had to dehumanize them in order to justify what they were doing to them. Same thing happened in Hitler's Germany. He had to dehumanize the Jews. The first thing Hitler had to do was not kill Jews or round them up and throw them into concentration camps. The first thing he had to do was dehumanize them, make them something other than human in the culture's mind. So then it became acceptable to do that to somebody that was not human. And they did it to Jews, they did it to Christians. The cannibals do it to other tribes. You just dehumanize them and you make them something else. So I asked the guy, I said, so what else contributed to your acceptability of killing them and then eating them? He said, I have to tell you, I always knew it was wrong. Always instinctively, he said, I knew it was wrong. But I was being told over and over again by my tribe that this made me an honorable man and that this built up my credibility within the tribe, so I engaged in it. But deep down inside, written upon the hearts of men, he knew that it was wrong. Those that engaged in the things that did in Hitler's Germany, I'm still in the overhead that I'm going to use today, I want you to read the book, Defying Hitler, because it explains all the stuff that's going on that we are redoing today, to bring this back to Chris's earlier point, that we're experiencing this stuff today, that we're going through the same process
Hierarchy.
that many went through.
Yeah.
Separation, dehumanize. Separation, dehumanize. And so we separate, and then each of the groups dehumanizes the other group. And then we fight. So we're seeing the same thing happen today. But this book, Defying Hitler, I've got a picture for the overhead here in a little bit, explains what was going on in Hitler's Germany. And I use this as an example last week or week before in a message I brought, where the guy that writes this book is acting as, he's in training to become a judge. So he is like one of the people that work as apprentices for the judicial system, that work as apprentices for judges. So he's training to be a judge. He said the thing that he noticed was that they went from arguing in court over legal briefs and judicial precedents, that they said, okay, this trial was done, that was determined that this was the outcome, and this impacts this trial because it's the same set of circumstances. We're going to go by the same set of standards. Well, if you've got a dictator like, let's say, Hitler or Dan Dorlock, who says he's the Christ, that he changes his mind, he can't have that. He can't have a fixed set of standards. He's got to have them movable and pliable, that he can change the rules as he goes along. So what happened was that in that circumstance, he could just change the rules as he went along. And what would happen is like the boiling frog syndrome. You throw the frog in a pot of warm water, he doesn't jump out. His muscles relax, he gets comfortable, and you just turn up the heat till he's boiling to death. And that's what happens to us over time. This becomes acceptable, and go, okay, I'll accept that. And then the next little thing, well, that doesn't seem like quite as acceptable, but if you hear it long enough and you hear it loud enough, well, I'll go ahead and accept that. And then the next thing happens, and then we're progressively carried down the road, getting totally away from any ethical standard that's fixed. You've got to have a moving target to have a secular worldview. Why? Because the secular worldview changes. And so it's got to be pliable, it's got to be changeable, it's got to be movable by whoever's in control of things. So that's why it becomes particularly dangerous. So everybody understand kind of where we're going with this. We need to understand there is a fixed set of standards in a Christian worldview that says this is the standard, and the standard doesn't change. No matter how much the culture changes, the standard does not change. The standard stays the same. All the culture can move around us, but this is our fixed set of standards. This is always right, this is always wrong. Wrong doesn't become more right over time because the leadership changes. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's do a little review from where we've been over the first class. So morality can generally be divided up into three primary categories. Things that are morally permissible, things that are obligatory, morally obligatory. That just means that it's an obligation that we act. This happens and it becomes an obligation that we act. What would be an example of something that's obligatory? Somebody help me out.
If I was driving, thank you. It's kind of like the Good Samaritan thing. If I was going along the road and I saw somebody that was in dire need of assistance, I am obligated to render assistance.
Okay. Is that obligatory or super obligatory?
I have no clue. I really admit.
Morally obligated. Morally obligated says, thou shalt not kill. So I'm not obligated. I can't kill because I'm obligated not to, according to Scripture.
Okay.
Going beyond, like he says, I'm not gonna try to say the words.
Above and beyond.
Above and beyond is the third one's
Yeah.
super, or, yeah. Anyways, yeah, that just means that, you go back down, like they gave the example in the book, like he gave the example in the book, he said, that plane goes down, or somebody's drowning in the water, not only does he go down for the first person, but he goes back down and he rescues more people that are drowning. He keeps going down until he finally dies. And that's over and
Above
goes,
and beyond,
yeah,
yeah.
above and beyond, so, yeah.
So the guys on the plane at 9/11 that went down in Pennsylvania, that the guy that says, let's roll, that's super obligatory. He wasn't obligated morally to do that. It was above and beyond the call of duty, but he went and did it. So there are things that we're mandated to do. I'm a husband of one wife. My faithfulness is totally to her and no other woman. I'm obligated to that because of my Christian worldview. How would the secular worldview view that? Same situation. Okay, pick up the mic.
Yeah, you can unravel that all you want. There's several different directions. You feel tired that you guys aren't connecting anymore. There's several different ways that becomes stagnant, blah, 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 blah. Christian standard says that you continue on no matter what, that you work through except for sexual immorality. But beyond that, yeah, secular says all the above.
If it feels good, do
Yeah,
it.
if it
You know?
doesn't, yeah, bye-bye.
Yeah. Who was that? Stephen Stills, I think, saying, if it feels good, do it. Do it if it's what you feel. Back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, yeah. Yeah, I am.
Or say, Christian world rule says, it simply says, I am beholden to my partner for these agreements I made, and I am beholden to God for these agreements I made. Secular world rule says, I am only beholden to myself.
Yep. That's exactly right. In the secular worldview, here's a great distinction. Watch this, write this down. A great distinction for the secular worldview: man is the center of all things, and an individual is his own center. So he makes the rules. It's a humanist, and if you go back and read the Humanist Manifesto, this is exactly what it says. Humanist Manifesto says, man is the center, and therefore man makes the rules. And if I'm gonna be refine that, then I'm gonna make the rules for me. The Christian says God is the center, and his standard applies to me. So you can see how we're going to have very different worldviews, very different ethics from the secularist, right? So you got the morally permissible, the things that we can allow to happen or that we don't have to involve ourselves in, that might be made better if we did involve ourselves in, but it's permissible to do. Permissible within the ethic, within the standard, the set of boundaries that God has set for us. You got the obligatory, which is the things that say you're obligated morally to remain faithful to your wife, right? So that faithfulness, I'm morally obligated to that by God, but the secularist wouldn't have the same obligatory standard. He might use the same words, but he's not going to have the same standard. The morally superobligatory is going to be to say, it's above and beyond the call of duty, I don't have to go do this, but I'm going to put my life on the line, I'm going to put it out there, I'm going to go do it. And it's a moral act. It has to be a moral act that you're choosing to do. What would be another example of an obligatory act?
I would almost say any bout of anything what we would call about forgiveness. When anything where I would be forgiving someone else
Okay.
for an action done towards me is a morally obligatory act.
Okay. So forgiveness would be a moral obligatory act to the Christ follower,
Yeah.
to a Christian. That's the Christian ethic. What about from a secular worldview? Is forgiveness obligatory?
No.
Okay.
It's situational because it would depend on whether or not the forgiveness benefits me.
So man's the sinner again. See, it keeps coming back to this, doesn't it? That man's the sinner of the standard. So, how does the fact of whether we have freedom of action determine whether something is indeed a moral act? What if I don't have freedom of action? What if I'm bound in some way? I don't have the freedom to act on a particular issue. Okay, let's look at it. Let's look at an example. Maybe I'm bound by law. I wouldn't have the freedom because the law would prohibit me from acting. I would like to, in my morality, in my ethic, to do away with every abortion clinic in the country. But do I have the right to go burn them every one down? I'm bound by law, am I not? I'm bound by law not to do that. There was a whole movement among so-called Christian movement, among people who were going around murdering the doctors that were performing the abortions. Okay, so I don't have the freedom to do that either morally or legally. So I have something binding me from doing that. But there were a whole group of Christians, I use air quotes here, Christians that thought themselves to have permission of God, and they justified this in their mind by saying, I have the right to take this doctor out because I'm only eliminating one life and he's going to eliminate thousands.
Yeah, murder is still murder. It doesn't matter. It doesn't
Okay.
matter what you.
So-
I believe it's probably somewhere in Scripture, I couldn't get it off the top of my head, there's something that says two wrongs do not make a right. Right.
Okay.
There you go.
So we're bound as Christians, but there's also binding of the person in the secular world. They may be bound by something else, the law or whatever, that keeps them from performing some act that they might think ultimately would achieve some moral good. When you start putting things in category like the moral good, what we're saying is that we're making our ethic, and this is where it would fall into secular ethics, our morals would become rooted in what we think would accomplish the greatest good for the most people. And so as soon as we go, that's the greatest good for the most people, and therefore it justifies any act I've got to do to make that happen. But that would fall into some secular ethics.
If like it's a situation on this regard. Like the question you always hear philosophers say, if you could go back in time, would you kill Hitler as a baby?
Yeah. So
It's still
you've
wrong.
got you got a lot of moral dilemmas that you can pose like that. But always the way they're positioned from a secular worldview is to think of, well, look what good it does for the greater good for the most people. And we can't say we're going to do anything by justification of we think will achieve the greatest good for the most people. It's still got to be by God's standard, right? But the secular worldview often says it's for the greater good for the most people. Now, let's put that in context of some of the things we're looking at today. We're looking at a lot of stuff today that says this is for the greater good for the most people. And therefore, we're going to justify this injustice in order to achieve a greater justice. And where we lose the ethical premise by saying that we're going to do some injustice in order to create a great justice, but it's not within the secular worldview or within a secular ethic. They would say that's okay. The means do justify the ends, right? So the ends, if the ends are what we want them to be, then any means it takes to get us there If the ends form a greater justice in my mind, again, focused on my own judgment rather than God's judgment, then I'll take that out on whatever it takes to do it. That falls within the secular ethic. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Did you have something?
And it doesn't necessarily have to be for the good of a whole bunch of people. It can be for the good of a few people because of who they are. There's
Yeah.
a move afoot right now.
And that's where you come back to the dehumanization. We can even look within our own culture and say, well, that group of people is of lesser value than our group of people. And that's what it's what the situation was in South America with these eating of other tribes. It was all to say, they're less than me, therefore this justifies my action. And then they would say something like, well, doing this also honors your tribe and also makes you stronger, like the eating of the heart of somebody you killed became honorable because it made you spiritually stronger. So those legends were woven into the justification.
That's happening right now in our culture is we have a lot of not only politicians but a lot of people in America who are citizens, become citizens of countries that were under Sharia law.
Yeah.
And there's Congress people right now who allegedly, have violated some of our laws in America, but they say, we were raised in a culture where this was tolerable, and we owe our allegiance to our culture,
Yes.
and therefore we want to change. And so one of the things that's happening right now, and there are 2 Supreme Court justices that came out with this opinion here in just the last few weeks, where they want to test, Sharia law, use it in different situations to see, if it's going to be any good for us.
Yeah. So where our standards are determines our ethical view, right? What our ethics are. Okay, so does a disciplined person knowing good from evil and choosing to do good or refrain from evil qualify as acting ethically? Does a discerning or disciplined person who knows good from evil and choosing to do good or refrain from evil qualify as acting ethically? Yeah. Okay, I got a yes? Yeah. Okay, both philosophers and theologians agree that something more is needed than just that.
Just refraining or?
Okay, let me give you an example of where I want to take this. If I am a Pharisee and I'm keeping the rules, I'm keeping the law, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for just keeping the law because there's something missing. What's missing?
This isn't just a guess, but maybe a goal? Maybe?
Say it again.
Maybe a goal? I'm not sure, but
A goal?
Yeah, goal.
end
Okay,
goal.
well, as long as the goal was of God or godly, okay, that could be part of it, yeah. What else? What is missing from just mechanically, this comes back to the conversation you and I had earlier, Chris, if that I'm just going through the mechanics of it, I'm just going through the motions. I come to church, I sit here, I warm a pew, I get up, I go home, I fix dinner, we pray over the meal. Does that make me a Christian?
Now, what part?
No.
Does that make me acting
Gee.
ethically?
One of the things that Jesus said when he addressed the Pharisees and people like that, he says, you honor me with your lips,
Yes,
but your hearts are far from me.
yeah. Same thing we were talking about earlier, that you end up with an empty, soulless, rule-keeping machine. And that doesn't qualify as being ethical either by philosophers or theologians. So both the secular worldview and the theologian would say, the secular worldview guy, the philosopher may say, I don't know what's missing, but something's missing.
I believe after World War II, there was millions of Germans who were living within miles of concentration camps, who essentially used it wasn't me. I wasn't, I kind of maybe knew something was going wrong, but I wasn't actively part of it. So that means that I had nothing to blame.
Yes.
The refrain from evil. I saw evil, I saw something bad happening, and I didn't take part of it. But,
Yeah. I didn't
but
actively.
I didn't act any way to stop it. I'm okay.
Yeah, and so that's another area we're going to come to is the fact that I'm not actively involved in participating in it. Does that excuse me and make me be acting ethically? Does that make me a moral person? Or if I know that it's going on, when does it become an obligation that I get involved in doing something about it? And am I going to make a deal? I mean, if I just go in there and charge the gates of the concentration camp and throw myself on the bayonet, what am I going to do? So what obligation do I have at that point to get involved and say, I've got to do something? Okay, in a lot of Europe, Elva and I traveled Europe a few years ago. In a lot of Europe, you come across these houses that were hiding Jews. Actively underground, get the Jews out of here, let's help them get to a safe place. That became a part of the action that was taken, but it was coordinated. It was underground railroad, so to speak.
I would say part of it, in that particular case, part of it was the fact that action should have been taken on a personal Christian view, say that action should have been taken long before it ever got to the point that a concentration camp were there.
Yeah.
Obviously, by that point, you can throw.
And reading this book I'm recommending to you will help us to begin to understand some of what was happening there, because it was literally the frog in the pot scenario. A lot of what was happening over time, and a lot of the daily living of the German people just went on like it always had. There wasn't really a big interruption in it. And so gradually they would hear about these stories of people just disappearing in this next community over, but because they didn't know any of them, they weren't personally involved, and they heard the stories, but their life was going on as normal. Maybe it wasn't true. Maybe these are just rumors that are flying around, So the point becomes for us as Christ followers is, when do we engage? When are we obligated to engage? And what do we do when we do engage? Do I fling myself on the bayonet, or do I do something that's more meaningful than that and is more productive than that in the kingdom? So all of those are real questions to ask. So Jesus does rebuke the Pharisees simply for keeping the law externally. He says you're whitewashed sepulchres, right? You're filthy on the inside, but you look good on the outside, right? So that tells us right off that just keeping the rules does not make us an ethical person. If I know it and I keep it, but there's no meat behind that, there's no personal reason for me keeping that, if there's something missing there, there's a soul missing there in that. So let's talk about normative ethics and meta-ethics. Okay, so normative ethics is what actions are morally right and obligatory. That's normal ethics. What would fit into those normal ethics? What kind of things would fit into normal ethics?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what about in secular ethics? Does that hold for secular ethics? No. Where I'm the center of the world?
Go ahead.
Do whatever benefits me.
Whatever benefits you.
Yeah.
That, for the secular worldview, you're exactly right. Whatever benefits me is the highest ethic.
Well, you can look at do unto others. Everybody keeps saying that one too, and that's a Buddhist way of looking. Do on the golden rule, but it's sort of perversion of what Christianity says.
Yeah.
I had a friend a long time who used to always incorporate that and think, well, when I do well, my brother does well. And when my brother does well, then I do well. And it sounds wonderful like the golden rule, but if you think about it, that is essentially still a me-centered view. Because I'm looking at it for, hey, when my brother does okay, I'm not going to have to worry about it. And, you know, and it is still essentially a me-centered. I'm doing okay. There's no God, there's no, you know, in that statement. It's all about, I'm doing fine because he's doing fine. I'm doing unto him because I know at some point, he's going to do unto me.
There's always
I'm not
that,
doing unto him
what am I going to get out of this?
Exactly.
And so am I doing this out of the goodness of my heart, whatever this is? Am I doing this out of the goodness of my heart, or do I have an ulterior motive? And my ulterior motive, as we grow as Christians, we begin to realize my ulterior motives aren't always obvious to me. Sometimes my ulterior motives are, I just like getting the pats on the back that I get. And therefore, I'm really going to go do this over here because this whole group of people over here, I get lots of pats on the back. I get my name in the newspaper. You know, I get this recognition. I get this, I get that. I feel good because I give money to this or that or the other. Therefore, if I feel good, that does something for me. So then I begin to have to judge my own self and ask myself, what am I doing for others or what am I really doing for me? So even those questions have to be asked at some point, right?
There is something I've said a little bit. When Chappie told me that I quantified it as the gift of help, that it's something that I have. There actually is some way that God actually put things in. There is something called the helper's high. When people help each other, the brain actually releases endorphins.
Yes.
And which is essentially endorphins are you could say essentially they're brain heroin that releases and it makes you feel good, which is kind of a fascinating. I mean, it's not necessarily selfish in that regard, but it is that God essentially put a way that gave an immediate, visceral response to helping people that made you want to do it again.
Yeah, and if you want to get into
It gives you that.
to understanding this a little more, read Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, any of the writings from Ayn Rand. She wrote about the fact that it was good to have selfish acts because selfish acts not only helped you but always helped somebody else. So you're doing something for a profit was actually helping somebody else that worked to create that product you bought because you're selfishly hoarding this. So there's this whole cycle that goes on. And she explains that whole process in a very brilliant secular way that'll help you understand the secular mindset in all of this. Okay, so what is the meta-ethics then? The meta-ethics, I saw Pastor John from up in Fortuna posted something on the meta-church today. And everybody's going, what's the meta-church? What's the meta-church? What's that all about? And at that point, he hadn't answered them, so I jumped in and I said, yeah, I just preached a message where I started talking about the meta-narrative and the metaverse and the meta-church. Well, the meta-ethic is a compilation of meta-narratives. What is a meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is a narrative, a story that's rooted in some standard of ethics. And the question then becomes what is that standard of ethics? What is the meta? So the meta, for instance, Facebook just changed its name to Meta. Meta is the standard by which you are creating the story. You've got a metaverse, which your verse is like the internet is a verse of standards or ethics that is acceptable to the culture. Now, how do we know it's acceptable to the culture? Because all of these groups now, like Facebook and Google and all of these and YouTube and all the rest of them, are beginning to censor the stuff they don't want in there that's not acceptable. So it becomes a metaverse of acceptable standards. The meta-church is a church that has established itself as having the meta, the set of standards that's acceptable to the church folks that may or may not be related to God's standard. It's just we're going to be good people. And the meta church, then, it becomes acceptable to sit home and watch on television the church service, and it's all going to be generally about the feel-good stuff. Just teach me, Joel Osteen, about the world. Make me feel good about me. And the metaverse provides a set of standards that is now culturally acceptable, that you can say, because it's culturally acceptable, it fits within the secular ethic, particularly if it serves me, or serves my people, or serves my community, or my family, whatever the meta area is. So the meta becomes the standard by which we judge the ethics. And we can have a lot of different meta-ethics. The meta-ethics for the secular worldview is very different from the meta-ethics of the Christian worldview. But as soon as it becomes culturally acceptable, we could call it a metaverse. So what is true then?
Or the frog boiling to death.
Yeah. So use your mic there. So here's the. Let me finish this thought process. So here's how the guy that wrote Defying Hitler said he recognized something was wrong. He said, before we would quote the law in order to justify our ruling on a case. Was the guy guilty or not guilty according to the law, the standards of the law? He said, I knew I was dealing with a different meta, a different set of standards, when the guys in the courtroom, the lawyers, began to argue not from the standard of the law or the cases that had preceded it. They judged according to, what did Hitler say? Hitler said, da 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 da. Therefore, we're going to judge this set of legal standards against this person, not on the law, but on the metaverse, the meta narrative, what was acceptable culturally. And so is our meta God's standard, or is our meta the secular standard? Now, there's nothing wrong with having a meta-narrative. A lot of times when I'm teaching, I'll use the fact that there are meta-narratives within the scriptural text. But the meta is always pointing back to a standard in which we can judge. So when you hear these catchwords begin to be thrown out, like meta-church, meta-narrative, metaverse, well, how are we going to figure something out? Well, I'll go to Google. Okay, Google. And I ask my question. And Google gives me an answer. Google has given me an answer that is acceptable within that metaverse, within the Google metaverse. Will that always be ethical? No. But it will fit the standard, the storyline, the meta-narrative of the meta that's acceptable, that which is acceptable culturally. Okay, so understand where our standards are coming from. So this ethical standard, where we get it from is really, really important. Oops, let's go back. So the normative is what actions are morally right and are obligatory. The meta-narrative I've just explained, and so let's look at meta-ethics, discussions about the meaning. The normative says what actions are morally right and obligatory. That's what the normative ethic is. What actions are morally right and obligatory? The meta-ethics asks the question, or is a discussion around what is the meaning of this? What is the meaning behind it? It's like when we're doing hermeneutics, what do we ask? What does this mean? What does the text actually mean? What's the meaning behind it? Is it about me or is it about God's standard? So the meta-ethics is discussions about the meaning of ethical terms such as right and wrong and obligatory. How do I know something is right? Well, because the meta-narrative within the courtroom says it's right. The meta-narrative within Google says it's right. The meta-narrative on Facebook says this is acceptable to the culture, so it must be right. Or what about this one? It's the law, therefore it's right. Well, abortion's legal, but does that make it right within God's standard? See, you have to ask these questions. At what point am I morally obligated to say no to killing somebody else, or to say yes, I'll go to war and potentially I will kill somebody else? How do I answer those questions? I mean, there's been volumes written by guys like St. Augustine on the morality of war. He's got a whole book called Just War Theory. It's about yay thick. Called How Do I Justify Going to War Morally as a Christian? And can I justify it? And how do I justify it? And what are the biblical standards I use to make that judgment? So we've got to discuss what is right and how do I know it's right? And what is wrong and how do I know it's wrong? Is it just wrong in this community, or is it just right in this community? Or is it morally, ethically, Christian, from a Christian worldview, right or wrong? Is it a moving target that it was right yesterday and wrong today? See, all of those things we have to ask. At what point am I obligated to get involved? When can I sit on the sidelines and not get involved? Okay, Elva and I are sitting at a banquet dinner in Charlotte, North Carolina one time. We're sitting at this dinner, and a lady at the next table apparently has a heart attack. Now, everybody's freaking out because the lady's literally laying in the floor, apparently having a heart attack. I'm thinking, okay, it's been a lot of years, but at one time I did learn how to do the compressions. I did learn how to do artificial respiration, mouth to mouth. I did learn that, but all this is rushing through my mind. Am I obligated to get involved if I'm not positive that I can get in there and help her? No. Or that I might harm her? At what point do I get involved? Is anybody else getting involved here? Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a nurse in the house? All of those questions you have to go through your mind. Is there somebody more qualified than me to do this? I mean, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Well, finally, this guy gets up, and yeah, he's a doctor, and he comes over there, and he does what needs to be done. But in the interim, how long did I take to figure that out, and how long was it going to be before that person died? All of those, what was obligatory on my part at that point? See, all of these questions, you fly through your mind in times like that, and you've got to figure out what is right and what's wrong. At what point am I obligated to go, okay, what if there hadn't been a doctor in the house? Yeah, I would have had to have gotten involved. But yeah, there might be consequences from that. She may have died and the family may have sued us. All of those things are possibilities as well, right? So we have to go through those questions, yeah.
So how does that work in terms of for us as individuals? Because that may not be the same for each of us. So in that situation, it may be better for one person to call 911 if they have no training. That might be quicker. Mm-hmm. But then if someone is a doctor, then obviously it's going to be better, more obligatory for them to go straight hands-on. And for someone in the middle might be saying, is there a doctor in the house? So, and that's kind of what I look at in life too, is we each have kind of a different purpose per se, in that we have the same ethics, but they might apply.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's making sense.
If my training had been more extensive and yesterday rather than 20 years previous, I think my obligatory position would have been greater. But as it turns out, I was actually late to the party too, because it was minutes before I realized there was somebody that was even in trouble. They were at the next table. But there was somebody there that finally did stand up and say, hey, is there a doctor in the house? The speaker needs to stop speaking so we can hear. Is there anybody here that's a doctor? And so all of that, but if I was a doctor, if I was an emergency room person, and I just went, I'm not going to get involved in that. I mean, I'm having a nice dinner here. My obligation would be to go and take care of the person.
So I guess it's just based on our discernment of where we fit in the ethics. You know what I mean? Like, I guess that's what I'm trying to look at, is that it may not be the same.
Oh, yeah, I would say it's not the same.
Application.
I think if that's the point you're making, you're absolutely right. I think it's not the same.
But then
at all.
how do we discern that, I guess is what I was getting at. Or
Okay.
what tools do we use to go through that checklist of where am I best used
Well,
in that situation?
I have to admit that I didn't have a checklist prepared for that. But all of that did rush through my brain. You know, it just went through, well, am I the best person for this? How long ago was it? It must have been 20 years ago. I mean, am I going to kill them? Am I going to get sued? Is there somebody better qualified? I mean, there was 200 people there, you know. So all those things go through your brain. Well, let me use another example, and then we can continue the conversation. So hold on just a minute, Mike. So I'm a Christian. I don't have the spiritual gift of evangelism. But somebody shows up at my door, or I meet on the street, or I hear about that doesn't know Christ. Where does my obligation come in?
It's obligatory because we're called by the word to
Yes.
share the gospel.
Yeah. But how many times have I ever heard, but that's not my spiritual gift, Pastor.
Interesting,
It's just
right.
not my spiritual gift. I don't do that. But we're all obligated as Christ followers to share Christ with other people. I don't have the spiritual gift of evangelism, but I'm obligated to share my faith with other people. So, yeah. Did you have something else, Charles? Okay. Okay. Yeah, Pastor.
How would you answer this one? This one came up at the mission within the last week. We were talking about the Israelites going into the promised land. And God says, you go in there and you get rid of all the idolaters. You kill them and drive them out and everything like that. So someone in their soap boldly declared that, and then some young buck, who wasn't all that young, but he's young in the Lord in the program, he says, hold on. What do we do with the commandment that says thou shalt not murder? So is God committing murder?
It's essentially the same question that you're asking about going to war, because it comes back to who's the authority. So when my country calls me to go to war, and I'm a citizen of that country, and I've sworn an obligation to that country, then I'm called to go to war, because that's the authority, Romans 13, right? So, but when God calls me to go in and do something, that's the highest call. It's the very highest call. And that comes back to the argument, is the God of the Old Testament the same God as the God of the New Testament? And we have to say, yes, he's the same God in both places, but there's a different purpose. There's a different purpose in his calling us to do different things there. But he called them to do that, and that is one of the things we look at and go, I don't understand that. But God was accomplishing his good, and that is his good that we're about here, right? The Bible and God is a standard. So if God is my standard and he calls and says go do that, then that's what he did. And that's what I must do. I'm answering his call.
And what was interesting, one of the guys in the program, older fella who'd been a Christian for a lot of years, he jumped in and he says, well, let's look at in order to understand this, we got to look at the context. Why did God say that?
Yep.
And then we had an excellent discussion for about 10 minutes on why God said to do that.
In some of those cases where God called for cleansings, the thing that's interesting to me is some of those times it was known ahead of time why he was calling them to do those things. But some of the times that wasn't revealed till long after. We simply went and did it because God said go to do it. And so the standard becomes, if whatever God says is the good. So how do we determine what is good and what is right? Because God said. So that's what's good and right. When God says it's wrong, that's wrong. And it will be wrong tomorrow, and it was wrong yesterday. And it was wrong in this culture, and it's wrong in that culture. So a lot of times when we're judging these things biblically, we have to ask ourselves another question. We ask ourselves this question. And this goes back to our hermeneutics class. Is what I'm being told in the Bible descriptive of what God commanded them to do at that point in time for a specific purpose, or is it prescriptive for all Christians for all times? I had a guy walk up to me my first Sunday in the church that I took over in North Carolina where Norm Geisler had been the pastor. I was the second pastor of that church. And the very first Sunday I was there, a guy walked up to me and says, "Do you know what's happening down the road here at this other church? You know what's happening?" He says, "I think we ought to get together here and all of us get together this morning and pray that God would kill them." We didn't pray God would kill them and send somebody to kill them. That's what's going on down there. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. And Norm Geisler had been the pastor of this church for years. That was my orientation for the church that Sunday. That was my first Sunday in the pulpit.
Forgive me, but what were they doing?
Well, that's irrelevant. The fact is, God hadn't called me to go down the street and kill them.
All right.
They were teaching some heinous stuff.
I guess so.
But it wasn't called, I was called to witness that it's wrong, but I wasn't called to kill them.
Yeah, amen.
Okay? So we've got to understand the standard. The standard is God, or the standard is what I think is best. And what I think is best may be for the most people, for the greater good for the most people, but I have to do something unethical to do that, to achieve that end. And that's never going to be God's call on you. It was not unethical for God to call them to go in and cleanse the land and to kill those involved. It's God's creatures, God's call, right? So, yeah, Mike.
Of the ethical terms such as right and wrong, I have a question, and part of it comes back to, like, not necessarily whether war is Christian right or wrong, but anymore, Chris and I, I'm not necessarily about topics we're necessarily going to talk about tonight, but Chris and I have had some heated discussions about certain things, and we've fallen on different sides on certain issues. Is it possible to necessarily be to fall on different sides of certain issues and still be part of a Christian ethics? Say, like, for
Okay.
example, war. In that regard, one could say, hey, it's okay to go to war. And one could say, hey, it's okay, I could be a conscientious objector and still be part of a Christian-minded.
Yeah, and this comes down to personal conviction. So, this is another reason that excellent hermeneutics is so incredibly important. If all we're doing is trying to stir the pot, and we're not going back to a good, sound, biblical, theological position for the decision I'm making, then that is not an ethical position. If I read the text and I can give you hermeneutical justification for why, okay, let's take thou shalt not kill. Literally, the word there means murdered. Okay, well, what is murder? Is that different than killing? What if somebody comes in my trailer back here in the middle of the night with a gun? Am I justified to shoot him and kill him? I would argue that I am. Okay, but that would fall into the category of thou shalt not kill, but I didn't murder that person. I'm defending myself. Am I obligated to go to war to defend my country? And then we have to get into all the questions that have been asked about places like Afghanistan and others. Am I really defending my country there? Am I really is that what I'm doing?
I'm just saying, is it possible, is it possible to have either or you and still be be part, and still consider, and one could still consider themselves as part of the Christian
Yeah.
worldview.
And
So
that's
are certain
exactly-
issues that you could say that the Bible, or it could honestly fall on either side. You could be a Christian and believe this, and still be a Christian and believe this, although on these separate issues they could be different, opposite,
Okay, I don't think they'd be opposite. No.
or at least different. Not opposite
Okay.
necessarily, but
There,
different.
there are gray areas, and we're going to talk about that today. There are gray areas within the context of the biblical worldview of ethical things. There are gray areas. And the large part of what Geisler contributed to this conversation, which last time I did give you an assignment, one assignment when you left here from the last class, and it was to read pages 29 and 30 in this book that answers that question.
I'm treating the West, I want to make
Okay, and it's Geisler's understanding of hierarchical ethics. We're going to talk about that today. So it will come into answering part of that question, Michael, but the short answer is this, that if you are doing excellent hermeneutics, your position on any issue and my position on any issue, if we're both doing excellent hermeneutics from the standpoint of Bible interpretation, we're going to come very, very close. We're not going to be in polar positions. We're going to come very, very close. And then we can sit down and hammer out those differences. And it may just be a difference of your understanding of the text and my understanding of the text, but we both did excellent hermeneutics. We both did excellent word studies. We both parsed the verbs exactly the way they should be parsed, but there was still something that was left undefined. And you, because of the way you were raised, you interpreted it a little different than me. But we're going to be so close that we're still going to have a Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is not miles apart, it's fractions of an inch apart.
Well, that's okay. If I read this, I'll like to say, I've read, because I've read the last two chapters, I've read all of it. And I'm going over it for a second time. I like to read. And for the most part, I agree with them. I have found there are certain situations through here where I disagree. And you were saying, it's not like it's not like a chasm of disagreement. I just disagree slightly in some areas. I disagree with a little bit of the way the logic is using in some areas. But that's what I was getting at. Whereas there's some areas where, and you know, where there isn't necessarily, there's not a right and wrong in the sense that what is bad or good. There's just a right and wrong in the sense that one sees it slightly differently than someone else.
Yeah, well, we're coming back to parsing words here, but the issues come down to, you say right and wrong differences in how we view things, but I think we're going to both have, if we're following within a Christian worldview, we're going to be very, very close if we're doing good hermeneutical work, and that's why we did hermeneutics before we did this class. Okay, so, yeah, go ahead.
Going to comment that you covered that in one of your recent sermons on unity.
Yes.
And I think that's that we can have the same ethics, but have maybe, I don't know if perspectives is the right word, based on like what you said, where we came from.
Right.
So our right and wrong may be the same, but on, I don't know, the lighter issues, but again, it's that we can have those differences but still be united as Christians.
It might even come down to just, okay, we agree on what's right and wrong, but we come down to how do I handle the situation?
Right, right.
You know,
And
how do I deal with this person in this situation?
right. And you covered that really well. I think it was one of the Romans ones recently, and I just remember it because it sticks to me in the word of unity, and that we don't all have to be the cookie cutter the same to be united in Christ.
Yeah, we don't believe in universal thought, but unity within diversity. That's who we are. Yes. So let's. Why don't we take a break? We got a few minutes. Let's take a 5-minute break if you need to run to the restroom.